The wind cut through Wyoming like God's own knife that February night in 1881. Thomas Mitchell pulled his coat collar higher and urged his mare forward along the fence line, ice crystals stinging his weathered face like buckshot. At 56, he had seen enough winters to know when nature meant business. This one meant murder. 18 degrees below zero and dropping fast. The kind of cold that could freeze spit before it hit the ground, that could kill a man in 20 minutes if he wasn't prepared. Thomas had been preparing for winters like this since he came home from the war 16 years ago, since he'd learned that survival was about details and discipline and never taking nature for granted. His breath formed clouds that crystallized and fell like tiny diamonds as he checked each fence post methodically. 3,000 acres of prime Wyoming grazing land stretched around him in the darkness, rolling hills that in summer looked like green velvet but now lay buried under 4 feet of snow. Every inch of it demanded his attention. The Aberdeen Angus cattle had been moved to the lower pastures weeks ago when the first serious snow started, but fence breaks in weather like this could spell disaster come spring thaw. A single broken post could let 200 head of cattle wander into a ravine, and at $40 a head, that was money Thomas couldn't afford to lose. The mare beneath him was a solid quarter horse named Belle, 13 years old and steady as bedrock. She knew this routine as well as he did, picking her way carefully through snow that reached nearly to her belly. Thomas ran a gloved hand along her neck, feeling the ice that had formed in her thick winter coat. The leather reins had gone stiff as iron in the cold, but Belle responded to the slightest pressure of his knees against her flanks. "Easy, girl, just 3 more miles of fence line and we'll be back to that warm barn with hot mash and fresh hay." Belle's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice, then swiveled back to listen to the wind. It was howling down from the Rockies now, carrying with it the promise of more snow. Maybe another foot before morning. Thomas had learned to read weather the way other men read newspapers, and this storm was telling him a story he didn't much like. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the frozen wilderness, a baby crying. Thomas reined in hard, Belle dancing sideways in the deep snow as she felt his sudden tension. He sat perfectly still in the saddle, straining to hear over the wind that roared through the pine trees ahead. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. 15 years of living alone could do strange things to a man's hearing. Sometimes on nights when the wind was just right, he thought he heard Sarah calling from the old rope swing by the creek, her 7-year-old voice bright with laughter. But there it was again. Weak and desperate, rising and falling with the gusts of wind that swept down from the mountains. A baby's cry, unmistakable now that he was listening for it. "Jesus Christ on a crutch," Thomas whispered, spurring Belle toward the pine grove. The crying grew stronger as he pushed through the snow-laden branches that hung low across the old deer trail. Pine needles heavy with ice showered down his back, melting against his skin and running cold streams down his spine. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. No baby should be out here in weather that could kill a grown man. Hell, no living thing should be out here except wolves and maybe a fool like him checking fence in a blizzard. The trees opened into a small clearing, and that's when he saw her. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, crawling through snow that came up to her chest. Her right leg dragged behind her at an angle that made Thomas's stomach clench, leaving a trail of dark spots on the pristine white ground. Even in the pale moonlight filtering through the clouds, he could see the spots were blood red, bright as holly berries against the snow. Behind her, wrapped in what had once been a blue wool coat but now looked like frozen rags, she pulled a bundle. The bundle was making the crying sounds, though they were getting weaker with each passing moment. Whatever was in there was still alive, which meant not frozen solid yet, but Thomas had seen enough death at Antietam and Shiloh to know the difference between fighting and failing. The child was moving slower now, each forward pull requiring tremendous effort from arms that shook like autumn leaves in a high wind. Thomas watched in stunned fascination as she fell face first into the snow, pushed herself up with hands that left red prints on the white ground, adjusted her grip on the bundle, and continued crawling toward his fence line, toward his land, toward him. She was heading somewhere specific, he realized. This wasn't random wandering. She was making for his property with purpose, as if she knew safety lay in that direction. The second time she fell, she stayed down longer. Thomas could see her small shoulders heaving with exhaustion, See the way her breath came in visible puffs that seemed to be getting smaller and farther apart. When she finally struggled back to her hands and knees, he noticed something clutched in her right hand, a piece of wood, maybe 2 feet long, carved with what looked like notches. She wouldn't let go of it even though her fingers had turned white with frostbite, even though holding it made crawling through the snow that much harder. That stick meant something to her, something important enough to hold on to when letting go might save her life. The third time she collapsed, maybe 50 yards from where Thomas sat frozen in his saddle like some useless statue, she didn't get up right away. The bundle in her arms stopped making noise altogether. That silence broke whatever spell had held Thomas motionless. He spurred Belle forward, snow flying from her hooves as she lunged through the drifts. He dismounted before she had fully stopped, his boots sinking immediately into snow that came up past his knees. Up close, the child looked even worse than he'd thought. Her lips were blue as a spring sky, her small hands blackened at the fingertips where frostbite was setting in. She'd been out here for hours, maybe since before the sun went down. Thomas knelt beside her in the snow, his wool pants immediately soaking through at the knees. The cold bit through the fabric like teeth, but he ignored it. "Child, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, brown eyes the color of rich coffee, but old eyes. Eyes that belonged on a woman of 40, not a child of 8. Eyes that had seen things no child should ever see. She tried to focus on his face, blinking slowly like someone fighting off sleep they knew would be permanent if they gave in to it. "Don't let him find us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that howled through the pines. "Please don't let the waterman find us." "Who, child? Who's the waterman? Who's looking for you?" But her small hand had gone limp around that notched wooden stick, though her fingers still curved around it like she was afraid someone would try to take it away. Her eyes closed, and for one terrifying moment Thomas thought he was too late, that he'd found them just in time to watch them die. Then he saw the slight rise and fall of her chest beneath the frozen coat. With hands that trembled from more than cold, Thomas carefully unwrapped the bundle the girl had been dragging. A baby boy, maybe 15 months old, with dark hair that curled against his skull and skin that had gone gray from the cold. The child was barely breathing, each tiny breath so shallow it was more like a sigh, but breathing nonetheless. Thomas had seen enough dying men on Civil War battlefields to know the difference between mostly dead and all dead. These children were mostly dead, which meant they could still be saved if he moved fast enough. The baby's clothes were better than the girl's, Thomas noticed. Newer wool, properly fitted, as if someone had cared enough to dress him warmly before sending him out into the storm, or before he'd been forced to run into it. Moving as gently as his big, work-roughened hands allowed, Thomas lifted the girl first. She weighed almost nothing, like a sparrow with hollow bones. Her broken leg hung at a sickening angle, and he could see where white bone had pushed through the skin just above her ankle. A compound fracture, the kind that in weather this cold and with this much blood loss would mean death from shock and infection within hours if it wasn't treated properly. The baby came next, wrapped carefully against Thomas's chest inside his heavy sheepskin coat. The child's breathing was so faint Thomas had to press his ear close to the tiny mouth to be sure air was still moving. Each breath seemed fainter than the last, like a fire burning down to its final embers. Thomas mounted Belle awkwardly, trying not to jostle the injured girl too much while keeping the baby secure against his chest. Every step the mare took caused the girl to whimper in her unconscious state, a sound that cut through Thomas like a dull knife. But there was no helping it now. Speed mattered more than comfort when death was racing the clock. He rode hard for the ranch house, Belle's hooves throwing up great clouds of snow that glittered in the moonlight like thrown diamonds. The children's weight pressed against him, and he found himself talking to them as he rode, his voice steady and calm, despite the fear that clawed at his chest. "Stay with me now, you hear? Just stay with me. Got a warm house waiting and the best woman in Wyoming to take care of you. Maria Santos can doctor anything from colic to gunshot wounds. Doc Harrison lives just 10 miles away, and he's saved more lives than Carter has liver pills. You're going to be fine. Both of you are going to be just fine." He wasn't sure if he was trying to convince them or himself, but the words seemed to help. The baby's breathing steadied slightly, and the girl's whimpering quieted to an occasional soft moan. The ranch house sat in a protected valley between two low hills, positioned to catch the morning sun while staying sheltered from the worst of the winter winds. Thomas had built it himself after the war, using timber he'd cut from his own land and stone quarried from the creek bed. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid and warm, with thick walls and good windows and a kitchen big enough to feed a crew of 20 ranch hands during calving season. Tonight, the kitchen windows glowed golden in the distance, promising warmth and safety and the kind of competent care these children desperately needed. Maria Santos had been keeping house for Thomas for 15 years, ever since the accident that took Sarah. She was 60 years old and tough as rawhide, with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or deliver a breech calf with equal skill. More importantly, she had raised 6 children of her own before coming to work for Thomas, and she understood what children needed in ways Thomas had forgotten. Thomas burst through the kitchen door without ceremony, snow and ice cascading from his coat onto Maria's spotless floor. She took one look at the children in his arms and immediately switched into the rapid-fire mixture of Spanish and English that meant her mind was working faster than one language could handle. Dios mío, what happened? Quick, put them on the table. Rosa, Rosa, bring all the blankets from the upstairs linen closet. She was already clearing the large wooden table with one arm while reaching for the children with the other, her movements efficient and sure. How long were they outside? Where did you find them? Don't know how long, Thomas said, laying the girl as gently as he could manage on the table where Maria kneaded bread every morning. Found them in the pine grove east of Section 12, trying to make it to the fence line. Maria's experienced hands moved over the girl's injuries while Thomas held the baby close to his chest, feeling the tiny heart beating like a frightened bird. The child had stopped making any sound at all, which was somehow more terrifying than the crying had been. This leg is very bad, Maria said, using Thomas's skinning knife to cut away the girl's frozen outer clothing. The fabric crackled like old paper, stiff with ice and dried blood. Bone is through the skin, this kind of break in this cold. She shook her head grimly. And look here, she pointed to the girl's forearms, where Thomas could now see old scars mixed with fresh injuries. Circular burns, maybe a dozen of them, in various stages of healing. Some were pink and new, others had turned the silvery white of old scar tissue. These are cigarette burns, Maria said quietly, crossing herself. Someone has been hurting this child for a long time. Thomas felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach, something that had nothing to do with the winter weather. You sure about that? I raised 6 children, Thomas. I know the difference between accidents and cruelty. Maria's voice carried a sadness that came from seeing too much of the world's darkness. The leg, maybe that could be an accident, but these burns? No. Someone did this on purpose. As she continued cutting away the girl's clothing, they discovered that the coat's lining had been carefully opened and crudely resewn with what looked like coarse horsehair thread. The stitching was uneven and hurried, as if someone had been working in poor light or under pressure. Something had been hidden inside that lining, something important enough to risk discovery. Get Doc Sam, Maria said, already wrapping the baby in warm flannel blankets and positioning him near the big wood stove that heated the kitchen. This little one's breathing is too shallow, and that leg needs more skill than I have. Go quickly. I'll do what I can while you're gone. Thomas didn't waste time with arguments or questions. He grabbed a fresh horse from the barn, a young gelding named Thunder, who was fast and sure-footed in snow, and rode back into the storm. The 10-mile journey to Carter's Ridge felt like 100, with the wind trying to tear him from the saddle and snow stinging his face like thrown sand. He found Doc Samuel Harrison where he always found him on nights like this, playing 5-card stud at Sullivan's Saloon. Harrison was a man in his early 60s, gray-bearded and steady-handed, who had been patching up ranch hands and delivering babies in this county for 30 years. He'd served as a field surgeon during the war, working in conditions that would have broken a lesser man, and there wasn't much he hadn't seen or couldn't fix. One look at Thomas's face was enough. Doc Harrison folded his cards, grabbed his medical bag from behind the bar, and followed without asking a single question. That was the kind of man he was, the kind who understood that some situations didn't allow time for explanations. The ride back to the ranch was treacherous, with fresh snow making the trail slippery and wind gusts strong enough to knock a horse off balance. But Thunder was young and strong, and Doc Harrison rode like the cavalry officer he'd been 20 years earlier. They made good time despite the conditions. By the time they returned to the ranch house, Maria had worked what miracles she could. The children were positioned near the kitchen fire, wrapped in every blanket and quilt in the house. The baby was crying again, weak but persistent, which Doc Harrison pronounced a very good sign indeed. Crying means the lungs are working and the brain isn't shutting down from hypothermia, he explained as he examined the infant with hands that moved with practiced efficiency. This little fellow is going to be fine with some warmth and proper feeding. The girl was conscious now, her teeth chattering so violently Thomas thought they might crack. Her eyes followed every movement in the room with an alertness that spoke of intelligence and a wariness that spoke of too much experience with danger. "What's your name, child?" Doc Harrison asked gently as he knelt beside the table where she lay. "Emma," she managed between chattering teeth. "Emma Carter. That's my brother Daniel." "And where do you live, Emma? Where are your folks?" Her eyes went wide with terror at the question. She tried to sit up despite her injuries, reaching frantically for the wooden stick that Maria had placed beside her on the table. "Don't tell him we're here. Please, you can't tell him. He'll kill us both. He'll kill Daniel just like he killed Mama." The naked fear in her voice made Doc Harrison pause in his examination. He caught Thomas's eye over the girl's head, and they shared a look that said they both understood this was about much more than children lost in a storm. "Nobody's going to hurt you here," Thomas said, moving closer to the table so Emma could see his face clearly. "This is my home, and you're under my protection now. But we need to set that leg properly, and I won't lie to you, child. It's going to hurt something fierce." Emma examined his face carefully, her gaze sharp with intelligence born of hardship. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly and reached out to take his hand. "I know it's going to hurt," she said quietly. "Everything hurts now. Just don't let go of me, please." When Mama set my arm that time, she held my hand the whole time, and it helped. So Thomas held her small hand in both of his while Doc Harrison worked to clean and set the compound fracture. Maria stood at the girl's head, singing a Spanish lullaby in a voice soft as summer rain, trying to drown out the necessary sounds of bone being set and flesh being sewn. Emma screamed twice during the procedure, sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs, but she never tried to pull her hand away from Thomas's grip. When Doc Harrison finally finished wrapping the splint with strips of clean cotton and lengths of supple rawhide, Emma was still conscious and still holding tight to Thomas's hand. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cold, and her breathing came in quick, shallow pants, but her eyes remained focused and aware. "You're about the bravest young lady I've ever had the privilege to doctor," Doc Harrison said, wiping his instruments clean with whiskey before returning them to his bag. "That leg should heal straight and strong if you follow orders and stay off it for the next month." The kitchen now smelled of whiskey and blood and wood smoke, with an undertone of the carbolic acid Doc Harrison used to prevent infection. Emma's eyelids were growing heavy as the laudanum he'd given her for pain began to take effect. But just before she drifted off, she started talking. Words tumbled out like water through a broken dam, as if she'd been holding them back for too long and couldn't contain them anymore. "Water rights, 1861, she mumbled, her voice thick with exhaustion and medicine. "Willow Creek senior claim, Mitchell and Carter joint filing, document 247B. Mama made me memorize all of it. She said if anything ever happened, I should find the territorial judge and show him the paper. She said the paper would save us." Her small hand tightened around that notched wooden stick one more time, clutching it like a weapon or a talisman, then gradually relaxed as sleep took her. Doc Harrison finished cleaning his instruments in a basin of hot water Maria had prepared, the metallic scraping of steel against porcelain loud in the sudden quiet of the kitchen. Outside, the wind had died down to a whisper, and the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of two children who had somehow found their way to safety through the worst blizzard in 20 years. "What do you make of all that?" Doc Harrison asked quietly, drying his hands on a clean towel. Thomas picked up the wooden stick Emma had been clutching and examined it closely in the lamplight. It was old, worn smooth by decades of use, made from some kind of hardwood that had darkened with age. Along one edge, careful notches had been carved at precise intervals, each one marked with what looked like dates scratched in tiny numbers. "Water rights," he said slowly. "And this here's a water gauge stick. My grandfather had one exactly like it when he first settled this land back in '61. You use it to measure creek levels each spring, then notch it to record the high water mark. It's legal proof of your water claim priority." He studied the stick more carefully, squinting at the faded numbers carved beside each notch. The earliest date he could make out was 1861, followed by others stretching forward through the years. Someone had been measuring and recording water levels on Willow Creek for 20 years, maintaining legal documentation of their prior claim. "Someone wanted these children dead," Doc Harrison said, his voice grim. "That leg fracture didn't happen by accident. Someone grabbed that child's leg and twisted it until the bone snapped. I've seen enough deliberate injuries to recognize the pattern. And those burns on her arms, those cigarette marks, they're weeks old. Someone's been torturing this little girl for a long time." Before Thomas could respond to that horrifying assessment, they heard the sound of horses outside. Lots of horses, moving fast despite the snow and the late hour. Maria moved to the kitchen window and peered through the frost-covered glass, her face immediately going pale as fresh snow. "Sheriff's coming," she said, her voice tight with worry. "And he's not alone. Must be 20 men out there. Maybe more." Thomas walked to the door and pulled it open, cold air rushing into the warm kitchen like an unwelcome visitor. Sheriff David Morgan sat his horse at the front of what looked like half the town's male population, their breath and that of their horses creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air. Torches and lanterns cast dancing shadows across the snow, making the whole scene look like something from a fever dream. Beside the sheriff, mounted on a fine black stallion that must have cost more than most men made in a year, sat a younger man Thomas recognized from around town. Vincent Wade, maybe 37 or 38 years old, wearing an expensive wool coat and a beaver hat that marked him as someone with money. Slung across his saddle was a surveyor's transit, the kind railroad companies use for mapping routes and measuring grades. Wade pointed directly at Thomas's front door, his breath visible in the cold air as he spoke. "That's where they are, Sheriff. I'm certain of it. That old hermit has my dead wife's children, and God only knows what he's done to them." Sheriff Morgan sighed deeply, a sound that carried exhaustion and reluctance in equal measure. He pulled a folded paper from inside his heavy coat, holding it up so Thomas could see the official territorial seal. "Mr. Mitchell," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I've got guardianship papers here, signed and sealed by Territorial Judge William Harding. Says Vincent Wade is the legal guardian of Emma and Daniel Carter, appointed by the court following their mother's death 2 months ago. I'm going to need you to turn those children over to their rightful guardian." Behind him in the kitchen, Thomas heard Emma whimper in her drugged sleep, a sound of distress that cut through him like a blade. In front of him, Vincent Wade smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Thomas's skin crawl. It was the smile of a man who had won a game nobody else knew they were playing. "Now see here, Sheriff," Thomas said, stepping out onto his porch despite the cold that immediately began seeping through his shirt. "That little girl's got a broken leg that was deliberately snapped, and she's covered with cigarette burns. She's been tortured, and she's scared to death of this man you want me to hand her over to." "That's ridiculous," Wade said quickly, his voice carrying just the right note of injured innocence. "Emma's always been a clumsy child, prone to accidents, and those marks on her arms are from cooking mishaps. I've tried my best to care for them since Margaret died, but they're difficult children. Traumatized by their mother's death, you understand. They need proper care, the kind only a family member can provide." Sheriff Morgan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Thomas had known David Morgan for 15 years, and he could see the man was uncomfortable with this whole situation. But legal papers were legal papers, and Morgan was the kind of lawman who followed the book even when his gut told him something different. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Mitchell," the sheriff said carefully, "but the law is clear. Mr. Wade has legal custody, properly granted by a territorial judge. These children belong with their guardian." "Give me 72 hours, Thomas said, thinking fast. "That little girl needs medical attention, and it's the middle of the night in a blizzard. Doc Harrison says moving her right now could kill her. Give me 3 days to get her stabilized, and then we can sort this out properly. Sheriff Morgan considered this, glancing back at the crowd of men behind him. Thomas could see the calculations running through the sheriff's mind. A dead child would raise questions nobody wanted to answer, especially if that child died while being moved at night in a blizzard on the orders of a territorial lawman. 72 hours, the sheriff said finally. But Mr. Mitchell, if you interfere with the legal transfer of custody after that time, I'll have no choice but to arrest you for kidnapping. Those are territorial statutes, and I don't have any discretion in the matter. Wade's smile disappeared, replaced by something that looked remarkably like frustration. Sheriff, I really don't think we should delay. Those children have been through enough trauma. They need to be returned to familiar surroundings as soon as possible. 72 hours, Mr. Wade, Sheriff Morgan said, his tone indicating the discussion was over. The weather's too dangerous and the girl's too badly injured to move tonight. We'll return Thursday at noon. As the sheriff turned his horse to leave, Wade leaned forward in his saddle and spoke directly to Thomas, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Enjoy these 3 days, old man, he said quietly, because when I get those children back, accidents have a way of happening, especially to children who talk too much about things that don't concern them. The threat was delivered with a smile, but Thomas heard it clearly. So did several of the men in the crowd, and he saw more than one face turn uncomfortable at Wade's words. Then the whole group was riding away, their torches disappearing into the distance like fallen stars, leaving Thomas alone on his porch with the wind and the snow and the weight of what he'd gotten himself into. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen watching Emma and baby Daniel breathe, listening to the wind that had picked up again and now rattled the windows like something trying to get inside. Maria had made coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, and they drank it in companionable silence while the hours crawled toward dawn. As the first gray light began to creep across the Wyoming mountains, Thomas found himself studying that notched water gauge stick again. The wood was worn smooth by generations of hands, and the dates carved along its edge told a story of careful record-keeping that stretched back 20 years, water rights from 1861. The same year his grandfather, Samuel Mitchell, had filed his original homestead claim, the same year the Wyoming Territory had opened for settlement under the Homestead Act. If Emma Carter was telling the truth, if there really was a legal document somewhere proving joint water rights between the Mitchell and Carter families, it would be worth more than all the cattle in Wyoming. In a territory where water meant the difference between green pastures and desert, where a reliable stream could support hundreds of head of cattle or thousands of acres of wheat, senior water rights were literally worth killing for. And Vincent Wade, with his surveyor's equipment and his expensive clothes and his legal guardianship papers, looked exactly like the kind of man who would kill for that kind of money. The morning sun slanted through the kitchen windows, warming Emma's pale face and making her blonde hair shine like spun gold. She looked so young lying there, so fragile and innocent despite everything she'd been through. It made Thomas think of Sarah at that age, all sharp elbows and stubborn determination, always asking questions about how things worked and why the world was the way it was. But Sarah had never known fear like what he'd seen in Emma Carter's eyes. Sarah had died in a simple accident, quick and clean, while Thomas was fixing fence just 100 yards away. These children had been running for their lives through a killer blizzard, and someone with legal papers wanted them back. Thomas picked up his coffee cup with hands that shook only slightly and walked to the window to watch the sun rise over his land. 3,000 acres of Wyoming territory, paid for with his own sweat and blood and the money he'd saved during 4 years of Civil War. Good land with strong grass and reliable water and enough timber to last a lifetime. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the wind still carried the promise of more weather. In 68 hours, Sheriff Morgan would return with his legal papers and his uncomfortable duty, and Thomas would have to make a choice that would change everything. He looked back at Emma's sleeping face and felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been locked away for 15 years. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless, especially then. The kitchen grew quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of 2 children who had somehow found their way to safety through the worst storm in memory. Thomas settled back in his chair with his coffee and began to plan. When Emma woke up, he would have questions that needed answering. And from the look of that hidden paper in her coat lining, she would have answers that men like Vincent Wade had been willing to kill to keep secret. The storm was over, but Thomas Mitchell had a feeling the real weather was just beginning to blow. Emma woke as the first pale light of dawn crept through the kitchen windows, her brown eyes opening slowly like someone emerging from deep water. For a moment she lay perfectly still, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with the careful alertness of a wild animal testing for danger. Then her gaze found Thomas sitting in the chair beside the table, and some of the tension left her small body. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the previous night's ordeal. "Right here, child." Thomas gestured toward the basket near the stove where the baby slept peacefully under a pile of Maria's quilts. "He's been sleeping sound for hours, taking milk like a champ when Maria feeds him." Emma tried to sit up, then gasped as pain shot through her splinted leg. The movement caused her to notice the hidden pocket in her coat lining had been opened, and her hand immediately went to her chest in panic. "The paper," she said urgently, struggling against Thomas's gentle hands as he tried to keep her lying down. "Where's the paper?" "Mama said never let anyone see it except the judge." "Easy now," Thomas said calmly. "Nobody's taken anything from you. Maria just had to cut your coat away to doctor your leg. Whatever was sewn in there is still safe." Maria appeared from the pantry carrying a bowl of warm broth that smelled of beef and vegetables. "The paper is here, mija," she said softly, producing a folded document from her apron pocket. "I kept it safe while we took care of you." Emma's hand shook as she reached for the document, unfolding it carefully despite the pain in her frostbitten fingers. Thomas could see it was an official territorial form, yellowed with age and spotted with what looked like dried blood. The territorial seal at the top was still clearly visible, along with several official signatures at the bottom. "Water rights certificate," Emma read slowly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Willow Creek, priority date June 10, 1861. Granted to Samuel Mitchell and Marcus Carter, joint claim under Territorial Statute 47B. Rights transfer upon death to surviving heirs of blood, not to be sold or assigned without mutual consent of both family lines." Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. Samuel Mitchell had been his grandfather, the man who'd first claimed this land when Wyoming was still wild territory. If this document was genuine, it meant the Carter and Mitchell families had filed their water claims together, as partners. "Your grandfather was Marcus Carter?" Thomas asked. Emma nodded, still clutching the paper like a lifeline. "Mama said he came west the same year as your grandfather. They were friends, helped each other build their houses and dig their wells. The water rights were supposed to protect both families forever. And this Vincent Wade, he's your stepfather?" The fear that flashed across Emma's face was immediate and visceral. "He married Mama last spring. Said he loved us, said he wanted to take care of us after Papa died from the fever. But after the wedding, he changed, started asking about papers, about property, started hurting us when Mama wasn't looking." Thomas studied the water rights certificate more carefully. If it was genuine, it gave the Carter children legal claim to half the water flowing through Willow Creek, the stream that supplied his ranch and half a dozen others downstream. More importantly, it was a senior claim, filed before any of the other water rights in the valley. In a territory where water was more valuable than gold, this piece of paper was worth a fortune. Harrison arrived as Maria was helping Emma drink the warm broth. The older man moved with the efficient calm of someone who'd spent 30 years dealing with medical emergencies, checking Emma's splint and examining baby Daniel with thorough professionalism. "The leg is setting well," he announced after unwrapping and rewrapping the bandages. "No signs of infection yet, which is remarkable given the condition she was in. This young lady has a constitution like iron." "Doc," Thomas said quietly, drawing the physician aside. "Take a look at this." He showed Harrison the water rights certificate, watching the man's eyebrows rise as he read the official language and examined the territorial seals. Dr. Harrison had lived in Wyoming long enough to understand exactly what such a document meant. "If this is authentic," Harrison said slowly, "it predates every other water claim in the valley by months, maybe years. Whoever controls senior rights to Willow Creek controls the future of every ranch from here to the railroad." "Vincent Wade's a surveyor for the railroad company," Thomas said. He'd know exactly how valuable water rights would be for their operations. Railroad needs 50,000 gallons a day minimum for their steam engines, Harrison confirmed, plus water for the workers, for the stock pens, for all the support operations. Without reliable water access, they can't build through this valley at all. Emma had been listening to their conversation with the sharp attention of a child who'd learned that adult talk often determined her fate. Now she spoke up from the table, her voice small but clear. The railroad man came to our house lots of times after Mama married Mr. Wade. I heard them talking about money, about contracts. The railroad man said if Mr. Wade could get the water rights, they'd pay him $25,000 and give him the surveying contract for the whole line. $25,000. Thomas whistled low under his breath. That was more money than most men saw in a lifetime, enough to buy a mansion in Denver or a cattle empire in Texas. It was certainly enough to kill for. Emma, Thomas said gently, settling into the chair beside her table, I need you to tell me exactly what happened to your mama. Can you do that? The child's face went pale, but she nodded with the grave seriousness of someone who understood the importance of truth. It was in September. Mr. Wade had been getting meaner and meaner, especially when he'd been drinking. He kept asking Mama to sign papers, said they were just legal things to protect our property. But Mama wouldn't do it. Did you see these papers? Once, when Mr. Wade left them on the kitchen table. Mama looked at them and started crying. She said they would give away everything Papa left us, everything Grandpa Carter worked for. She said the water rights belonged to me and Daniel, and she was holding them in trust until we were grown. Emma's hands twisted in the blanket Maria had tucked around her. The memory was clearly painful, but she continued with the determination of someone who'd been carrying a terrible secret for too long. That night in September, Mr. Wade came home drunk and angry. He said the railroad people were getting impatient, that there was money to be made if only Mama would stop being stubborn. He dragged her outside by her arms, right here. She touched her own upper arms where Thomas could see faint bruises that might have been finger marks. I followed them. I was scared, but I had to see. Mr. Wade took Mama to the old well behind our house. It's real deep, 40 feet or more, and the sides are all stone. He told her to sign the papers or he'd throw her down the well. Mama was holding Daniel because he'd been crying. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. Mama looked right at me where I was hiding behind the woodpile. She knew I was watching, and she threw Daniel to me, just tossed him like he was a sack of grain. I caught him, but barely. Thomas felt his throat tighten. A mother's last act, protecting her children even as death reached for her. Then Mr. Wade pushed her. She fell backwards into the well. I heard her hit the water way down at the bottom. I heard her scream once, then nothing. Mr. Wade climbed down with a rope and pulled her out, but she was already dead. What did Wade tell people about how she died? He said she died from complications after Daniel was born. Said something went wrong months later, like sometimes happens to women. But Daniel was born in March and Mama died in September. Anyone who can count knows that doesn't make sense. Dr. Harrison had been listening with growing anger. A delayed postpartum death 6 months after birth? That's medically impossible. Any doctor would know it was a lie. What about Dr. Hayes? Thomas asked. He signed the death certificate. Hayes left town right after Mama died, Emma said. Packed up in the middle of the night and went to California. People said it was strange, but Mr. Wade told everyone the doctor was just ready to retire. Thomas and Dr. Harrison exchanged meaningful looks. A doctor suddenly leaving town after signing a suspicious death certificate suggested either fear or bribery, possibly both. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Thomas could see a small group of riders coming up the valley trail. As they drew closer, he recognized Sheriff Morgan, but this time the lawman was accompanied by only 2 deputies instead of the small army from the night before. Stay calm, Thomas told Emma as the riders approached the house. Sheriff Morgan's a fair man. Just tell him the truth. Sheriff Morgan dismounted and approached the porch with obvious reluctance. He was a man in his 40s, graying at the temples, who'd served as law enforcement in Wyoming Territory for 15 years. Thomas had always found him to be honest and competent, though perhaps too rigid in his interpretation of legal procedures. Morning, Thomas. Doc. The sheriff touched the brim of his hat politely. I wanted to check on the children's condition and discuss the situation before Thursday's deadline. Come in, Sheriff, Thomas said. Emma's awake and feeling some better. Maybe she can answer some questions for you. Inside the warm kitchen, Sheriff Morgan removed his hat and studied Emma with professional attention. His eyes took in her obvious injuries, the carefully splinted leg, the fading bruises on her arms. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than Thomas had expected. Hello, Emma. I'm Sheriff Morgan. I know you've been through something terrible, but I need to understand what happened. Can you tell me about the night you ended up in the storm? Emma glanced at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. Then she began to speak, telling her story in the same clear, determined voice she'd used before. She described Wade's increasing violence, the attempts to force her mother to sign legal papers, the night of her mother's murder, and the mounting fear that had finally driven her to take Daniel and run into the blizzard. Sheriff Morgan listened without interruption, taking notes in a small leather notebook. When Emma finished, he was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the implications of what he'd heard. These are serious allegations, Emma, he said finally. Murder, fraud, child abuse. You understand that if you're telling the truth, Mr. Wade could hang for what he's done. I know, Emma said simply, but I saw what I saw. And he said if I ever told anyone, he'd drown Daniel too. He said accidents happen to children all the time, and nobody would question it. Dr. Harrison stepped forward. Sheriff, I've examined both children thoroughly. Emma has multiple injuries consistent with systematic abuse over an extended period. Old fractures, burns, bruises, and various stages of healing. This isn't the result of normal childhood accidents. And I've seen the water rights certificate, Thomas added. If it's genuine, it explains why Wade would want these children dead. $25,000 from the railroad company, plus the surveying contract for the entire line. That's motive enough for murder. Sheriff Morgan studied the certificate Thomas handed him, his expression growing more troubled as he read the official language. This would need to be verified by the Territorial Land Office. The seals look authentic, but forgery isn't unknown in matters involving this much money. Then let's verify it, Thomas said. The Land Office has all the original filing records. If this certificate matches what's on file, Wade's guardianship claim becomes irrelevant. Dead men can't be legal guardians, and murderers can't inherit from their victims. The sheriff was clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Legal guardianship papers signed by a territorial judge carried enormous weight, but so did evidence of murder and fraud. His job was to enforce the law, but which law took precedence when they seemed to conflict? I'll need to investigate these claims thoroughly, he said finally. But until I have concrete evidence of wrongdoing, those guardianship papers remain valid. Mr. Wade has legal custody, and I'm obligated to enforce that custody order. Give us more time, Thomas said urgently. 48 hours to gather evidence. Let us examine the Land Office records, interview witnesses, document everything properly. If Wade is innocent, the investigation will prove it. If he's not, he'll know we're investigating and might try to run, Sheriff Morgan finished. Or worse, he might try to eliminate the witnesses before we can build a case. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats approached once again. This time it was Vincent Wade himself, accompanied by 3 men Thomas didn't recognize. They looked like hired guns, the kind of men who solve problems with violence rather than law. Wade dismounted and approached the porch with an air of injured righteousness. Sheriff Morgan, I'm concerned about the welfare of my children. I've heard disturbing reports about their condition, and I think they should be moved to proper medical care immediately. Dr. Harrison has been treating them, Sheriff Morgan said carefully. They're receiving excellent care. With respect to Dr. Harrison's skills, these children need specialized treatment that might be better provided in town, Wade replied smoothly. I've arranged for them to be examined by Dr. Caldwell, who has more experience with trauma cases. Thomas knew Dr. Caldwell by reputation. The man was competent enough, but he was also known to be flexible in his medical opinions when the price was right. If Wade wanted the children examined by Caldwell instead of Harrison, it probably meant he needed a different medical opinion for legal purposes. The children are too badly injured to be moved, Dr. Harrison said firmly. Emma has a compound fracture that's just beginning to set properly. Moving her now could cause permanent damage or even death from shock. Wade's face darkened slightly, though he maintained his reasonable tone. Dr. Harrison, I appreciate your concern, but as their legal guardian, I believe I'm better qualified to make decisions about their medical care. Their medical care isn't the issue here, Thomas interjected. The issue is Emma's allegations about her mother's death and the systematic abuse she and Daniel have suffered. For just a moment, Wade's mask slipped, and Thomas saw something cold and calculating in the man's eyes. Then the concerned stepfather expression returned, and Wade shook his head sadly. I'm afraid Emma has been traumatized by her mother's death and has developed some unfortunate delusions. Children sometimes create elaborate fantasies to explain tragedies they don't understand. It's quite common in cases of severe grief. Delusions don't create cigarette burns, Dr. Harrison said flatly. I know the difference between accidental injuries and deliberate torture. Those marks are from cooking accidents, Wade replied without hesitation. Emma has always been clumsy around the stove. I've tried to teach her to be more careful, but children will be children. Emma had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. Now she spoke up, her voice carrying clearly despite her weakness. You're lying. You held the cigarettes to my arms yourself. You said it would teach me not to ask questions about the papers. Wade's expression didn't change, but one of the men with him shifted uncomfortably. Thomas noticed the movement and filed it away for later consideration. You see, Wade said sadly. The poor child is clearly disturbed. This is exactly why she needs proper medical evaluation and care. Sheriff Morgan was watching this interchange with obvious discomfort. As a lawman, he was trained to evaluate evidence and testimony, but he was also bound by legal procedures that didn't always align with justice. Mr. Wade, the sheriff said slowly, given the serious nature of these allegations, I think it would be appropriate to postpone the custody transfer until a full investigation can be completed. On what legal grounds? Wade's voice carried a sharp edge now. I have proper guardianship papers signed by Territorial Judge William Harding under the Wyoming Territorial Custody Act of 1879. These children are my legal wards, and I have every right to determine their care and custody. On the grounds that murder charges take precedence over custody disputes, Thomas said. If Emma's telling the truth about what happened to her mother, you're not a guardian, you're a killer. Wade turned to face Thomas directly, and for a moment his careful mask dropped entirely. Thomas saw naked hatred in the man's eyes, along with the kind of cold calculation that belonged on the face of a professional killer. That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Mitchell, Wade said softly. I hope you're prepared to face the consequences of making false statements about a respectable citizen. I'm prepared to face the consequences of protecting two children from a murderer, Thomas replied evenly. The tension in the kitchen was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thomas could see that Sheriff Morgan was torn between his legal obligations and his growing suspicions about Wade's true character. Dr. Harrison stood beside Emma's makeshift bed like a guardian angel, his medical bag within easy reach of instruments that could serve as weapons if necessary. Wade seemed to sense that the situation was slipping away from him. He glanced at his three companions, and Thomas saw some kind of signal pass between them. Whatever Wade had planned originally, he was adapting his strategy to meet changing circumstances. Sheriff Morgan, Wade said, his voice returning to its reasonable tone, I understand your desire to be thorough, but the law is clear. I have legal custody of these children, granted by proper authority. If you refuse to enforce that custody order, you'll be in violation of your sworn duty. And if I enforce an order that results in the death of children, I'll be responsible for that too, Sheriff Morgan replied grimly. I'm prepared to take that risk if it means protecting innocent lives. Wade's smile was thin and cold. Very well, but I want it on record that I'm being denied access to my legal wards by local authorities who are interfering with territorial law. I'll be filing complaints with the territorial governor and the federal marshal. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. I'll also be consulting with my attorney about civil charges against anyone who's spreading false accusations about my character. Slander is a serious crime, gentlemen. I trust you'll remember that. After Wade and his men left, the kitchen fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Everyone understood that the stakes had just been raised significantly. Wade was no longer just a man trying to reclaim custody of his stepchildren. He was a man fighting for his life and freedom. With the resources and ruthlessness to make that fight extremely dangerous. "We need evidence," Sheriff Morgan said finally. "Real evidence that will stand up in territorial court. Water rights certificates, witness testimony, medical documentation, anything that can prove Wade is lying about his relationship with these children." "The land office records," Thomas said. "If that water rights certificate is genuine, it will be on file there. And if it's genuine, it proves Wade has a $25,000 motive for murder." "I'll examine the children more thoroughly," Dr. Harrison added. "Document every injury, photograph everything if I can arrange for the equipment. Medical evidence doesn't lie." "What about other witnesses?" Sheriff Morgan asked. "Anyone who might have seen or heard something suspicious around the time of Margaret Carter's death?" Emma spoke up from her position on the table. "Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house saw Mama with bruises lots of times, and Father O'Brien might have records about when Daniel was really born." "We'll need all of that," the sheriff said, "but we'll need to work fast. Wade's not going to sit idle while we build a case against him. He's got money, connections, and now he knows we're on to him." As if to emphasize the sheriff's point, Maria suddenly called out from the window where she'd been watching the departing riders. "They're not leaving. Mr. Wade's men are setting up camp in the grove by the creek. Looks like they plan to stay." Thomas moved to the window and confirmed Maria's observation. Wade's 3 companions had indeed made camp within sight of the ranch house, positioned where they could watch in all the approaches. It was a clear message. The children were under surveillance, and any attempt to move them or gather evidence would be observed and potentially intercepted. "He's keeping us bottled up," Thomas said grimly. "Can't investigate if we can't leave the ranch." "Then we'll have to bring the investigation here," Sheriff Morgan said. "I'll send my deputies to the land office and the church. You keep the children safe, and Dr. Harrison can document the medical evidence. We'll piece this together bit by bit." But even as they made their plans, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time with a head start that was far too small. Wade was desperate now, and desperate men with money and connections could be extremely dangerous. Outside, the wind was picking up again, carrying the promise of more snow. The storm that had brought Emma and Daniel to his door might be over, but Thomas suspected the real tempest was just beginning to build. The children's safety, the truth about Margaret Carter's death, and the future of water rights worth $25,000 all hung in the balance. And somewhere out there in the Wyoming wilderness, Vincent Wade was planning his next move in a game where the stakes were measured in human lives. Thomas settled back into his chair beside Emma's makeshift bed, his rifle within easy reach, and prepared for whatever was coming next. The 72-hour deadline was still ticking, but he had a feeling time was about to become the least of their problems. Wednesday morning dawned clear and bitter cold, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant mountains look close enough to touch. Thomas stood at the kitchen window, watching Sheriff Morgan's deputies ride hard up the valley trail, their horses throwing up clouds of snow that glittered like diamonds in the early sunlight. The urgency in their approach, the way they pushed their mounts despite the treacherous footing, told him everything he needed to know before they ever reached the house. Deputy Jake Wilson dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his face grim beneath a mustache crusted with ice from the hard ride. Steam rose from both man and animal in the frigid air as he approached the porch with long, purposeful strides. "Thomas, we got trouble," Wilson announced without preamble, his breath forming clouds as he spoke. "Big trouble, the kind that gets people killed." Sheriff Morgan appeared moments later, leading a string of pack horses loaded with official documents, surveying equipment, and what looked like the new photographic apparatus the territorial court had recently acquired. His expression carried the weight of a man who had just discovered that a local dispute involved forces far beyond his jurisdiction or experience. Behind them came Federal Marshal James Crawford, a lean man in his 50s whose reputation for dealing with territorial corruption had reached even this remote corner of Wyoming. His presence alone signaled that the situation had escalated beyond simple custody disputes into matters of federal concern. "The water rights certificate is genuine," Sheriff Morgan said without ceremony, pulling a thick leather folder from his saddlebags and setting it on the kitchen table where Emma could see. "Filed June 10th, 1861, recorded in the Territorial Land Office, with all proper seals, witness signatures, and surveyor's measurements. Document 247B, exactly as Emma memorized it." Thomas felt his breath catch as he examined the official papers. The territorial seal was crisp and clear, the ink still legible after 20 years. Samuel Mitchell and Marcus Carter, joint water rights claim, senior priority throughout the Willow Creek watershed. It was exactly what Emma had described, proof that their grandfathers had worked together to establish the foundation of what would become two family fortunes. But that's not the worst of it, Deputy Wilson continued, pulling additional documents from a leather case. Those rights aren't worth $25,000 to the railroad. Try $250,000, maybe more. Marshall Crawford stepped forward, his expression grave. The Union Pacific isn't just building through this valley, Mr. Mitchell. They're establishing the primary water depot for their entire transcontinental route through Wyoming territory. Every train that crosses the continent will need to refill here. Without senior rights to Willow Creek, they'll have to reroute 200 miles south through Colorado, adding years to construction and millions to costs. Emma, who had been listening from her position on the kitchen table where Dr. Harrison was examining her healing leg, spoke up with the clarity that always surprised adults who underestimated her intelligence. That's why he killed Mama. Not just for money, but for enough money to buy a whole state. That's exactly right, child, Marshall Crawford confirmed. But it gets worse. We found correspondence between Vincent Wade and railroad executives dating back 6 months before he married your mother. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was a carefully planned conspiracy. Dr. Harrison looked up from his medical examination, his face darkening with anger as he processed the implications. He courted and married Margaret Carter specifically to gain access to the water rights. Every kindness, every promise of love, every moment of what that woman thought was happiness was just part of a scheme to steal from her children. Thomas felt his hands clench into fists. He had seen evil during the war, watched men commit atrocities for causes they believed in, but this was different. This was evil for pure greed, the deliberate destruction of a family for money. Deputy Wilson pulled out another set of papers, these bearing the official letterhead of the Wyoming Territorial Land Office. We found the town clerk, Ezra Walsh, and he's confessed to everything. Wade paid him $500 to falsify Margaret Carter's death certificate, backdate several property transfers, and hide the original water rights filings. Walsh is terrified now, talking faster than a preacher at a tent revival. What about Dr. Hayes? Thomas asked. The physician who originally signed the death certificate? Dead, Marshall Crawford said flatly. Found him 3 days ago in a Sacramento rooming house. Apparent suicide, but he left a detailed confession. Said Wade paid him $1,000 to falsify the medical records, then threatened to kill him if he ever talked. His conscience finally got the better of him. The kitchen fell silent except for the crackling of the wood stove and the soft sound of baby Daniel's breathing from his basket near the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows with the promise of more weather moving in from the mountains. Maria, who had been preparing coffee with the methodical precision of someone trying to stay calm during a crisis, suddenly appeared at the kitchen window. Her face had gone pale beneath her olive complexion, and her hands trembled as she pointed toward the tree line. Thomas, she said, her voice tight with controlled fear. There are men with rifles in the trees. I can see at least 6, maybe more. They have all the roads covered. Thomas moved to the window and studied the terrain with the tactical eye he'd developed during 4 years of brutal warfare. The gunmen were positioned with military precision, each one commanding a field of fire that overlapped with his neighbors. Every possible escape route from the ranch was covered, every approach controlled. It was a professional siege, designed by someone who understood both the terrain and the principles of small unit tactics. How long have they been there? Sheriff Morgan asked, joining Thomas at the window. I first noticed movement about an hour ago, Maria replied, but they could have been in position since before dawn. They're not trying to hide anymore. Marshall Crawford pulled a pair of field glasses from his saddlebag and studied the positions carefully. 8 men that I can identify, all carrying military-grade rifles. They're positioned defensively, not preparing for an assault. This is containment, designed to keep you from leaving and anyone else from arriving. Where's Wade? Thomas asked. That's what we'd like to know, Sheriff Morgan replied grimly. He disappeared from his hotel room sometime during the night, along with his surveying equipment and about $2,000 in railroad money he'd been carrying. The hotel clerk said Wade was visited by several men around midnight, strangers who looked like they'd been hired for unpleasant work. Dr. Harrison finished his examination of Emma's leg and stood up, his expression mixing medical satisfaction with deep concern. The fracture is healing well, but Emma's not ready for any kind of physical stress. Moving her could cause the bone to shift, possibly creating permanent damage. Then we don't move her, Thomas said firmly. We make our stand here. Against 8 professional gunmen? Deputy Wilson asked incredulously. Thomas, I know you're a veteran, but this isn't the war. These men are being paid to kill, not to take prisoners. Emma struggled to sit up despite her splinted leg, her young face set with the determination that had carried her through a blizzard with her baby brother in her arms. There's something else you need to know. Something I didn't tell you before because I was scared Mr. Wade would find out somehow. All eyes turned to the 8-year-old girl whose testimony would determine whether Vincent Wade faced justice or escaped to kill again. Thomas moved closer and took her small hand, feeling the calluses that marked her as a child who had learned to work for her survival. What is it, Emma? Before Mama died, she found some letters in Mr. Wade's coat pocket. She couldn't read very well, but she knew they were important because he kept them locked in his money box. So she copied them out, word for word, and hid them. Marshal Crawford leaned forward intently. Where did she hide these copies, child? In the church basement. Father O'Brien has a key to the storage room, but he doesn't know what Mama put down there. She told me if anything happened to her, I should tell someone about the papers in the wooden box marked with a cross. The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. If Margaret Carter had documented evidence of Wade's conspiracy in writing, hidden where Wade couldn't find and destroy it, they would have ironclad proof of premeditation for murder. But it also meant Wade knew those papers existed somewhere, and he would do anything to prevent them from reaching a territorial court. Sheriff Morgan was already putting on his coat. Father O'Brien's church is only 2 miles away. If I take the back trail through the timber, I might be able to reach it without being spotted by Wade's men. Too dangerous, Marshal Crawford said firmly. Those gunmen aren't positioned randomly. They'll have the church under surveillance too, waiting for exactly that kind of move. As if summoned by their conversation, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley. Maria cried out from the window, pointing toward the barn where one of Thomas's ranch hands was stumbling toward the house, blood streaming from a shoulder wound. Miguel, Thomas called out, recognizing his foreman despite the man's obvious pain. Get to cover! Miguel made it to the kitchen door and collapsed against the frame, his shirt dark with blood, but his eyes alert and angry. Boss, they got the place surrounded tight, spotted me checking the horses, and put a bullet through my shoulder to send a message. Dr. Harrison immediately began examining Miguel's wound while the injured man continued his report. 8 men total, all carrying Sharps rifles and plenty of ammunition. They're dug in for a long siege, not planning any quick assault. But boss, there's something else. I saw Wade himself about a half-mile up the valley, setting up what looks like a command post with field glasses and signal flags. Thomas felt the familiar cold calm settle over him, the same mental state that had kept him alive through battles like Antietam and Chancellorsville. This was war now, not a legal dispute or a custody argument. Wade had moved beyond attempting to manipulate the system. He was now trying to eliminate witnesses through direct violence. How many guns do we have? He asked Sheriff Morgan. 6 rifles between my deputies and myself, plus whatever weapons you keep here on the ranch. Thomas mentally inventoried his armory. 4 Winchester repeaters, 2 Sharps buffalo guns, and about 300 rounds of mixed ammunition, plus handguns for close work if it comes to that. Against 8 professional killers with prepared positions and unlimited ammunition, Marshal Crawford said grimly. Not good odds, even for experienced fighting men. Emma's voice cut through their tactical discussion with the clarity of absolute determination. They can't have the papers from the church if they can't catch the person who knows where they are. Thomas looked down at the little girl whose courage had already saved her brother's life and whose testimony would condemn a murderer. What are you thinking, child? I'm thinking that Mr. Wade needs me alive to find those papers. He can kill all of you, but he can't risk killing me until he has what Mama hid. That gives us something to bargain with. The adults exchanged glances over Emma's head. The 8-year-old girl was right, but her logic led to a conclusion that made Thomas's blood run cold. Wade would indeed keep Emma alive, but only long enough to extract the location of the hidden evidence. After that, both children would become liabilities to be eliminated. No, Thomas said firmly. We're not using you as bait, Emma. We'll find another way. Before Emma could argue, Maria called out from the window again, her voice tight with new alarm. More riders coming. Looks like Wade himself with a white flag. Thomas moved to the window and confirmed Maria's observation. Vincent Wade was indeed approaching under a flag of truce, accompanied by 2 armed men who stayed well back, while Wade himself rode to within shouting distance of the house. Wade looked different than he had just days earlier. The expensive clothes were travel-stained and wrinkled. His face showed the stubble of a man who hadn't slept, and his eyes carried the desperate intensity of someone who knew he was running out of options. Mitchell, Wade called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. I want to talk. Just you and me, man to man. Thomas stepped onto the porch, his Winchester rifle held casually but ready for immediate use. Talk about what, Wade? How you murdered Margaret Carter? How you've been torturing her children? How you're planning to steal water rights worth $250,000. Wade's composure cracked slightly at the mention of the water rights' true value. You don't understand the forces you're dealing with, Mitchell. This isn't just about me anymore. The railroad company has investors, politicians, judges in their pocket. Even if you kill me, they'll send others. Professional killers who won't hesitate to burn down this house with everyone inside. Then why are you here talking instead of shooting? Thomas called back. Because I'm offering you a way out, Wade replied. Give me the children, and I'll make sure you and your people can leave Wyoming territory safely. Refuse and everyone dies, including those children you are trying to protect. Thomas felt anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice level and controlled. Counteroffer, Wade. Surrender yourself to Federal Marshal Crawford. Confess to murdering Margaret Carter, and maybe you'll live long enough to face trial instead of a lynch rope. Wade's laugh carried no humor, only the brittle sound of a man balancing on the edge of complete breakdown. You really think this is about justice? This is about money, Mitchell. More money than exists in most territorial banks. The railroad company will pay any price, kill anyone necessary to secure those water rights. Then they can negotiate with Emma when she comes of age, Thomas replied. Legally and honestly, the way business should be conducted. Emma won't live to come of age unless you give her to me right now, Wade said, his reasonable tone not quite masking the underlying threat. I have 8 men positioned around this ranch, and they have orders to kill everyone here if negotiations fail, including the children. Thomas raised his rifle slightly, not quite aiming but making his intentions clear. Those men work for money, Wade. Dead employers don't pay wages. Something happens to you, they'll probably decide their contract is terminated. Wade's face darkened with frustration and growing desperation. You have 1 hour to decide, Mitchell. After that, my men have orders to begin the assault. And I promise you, when they're finished, there won't be enough left of this place to bury. With that, Wade wheeled his horse around and rode back toward his command post, leaving Thomas standing on the porch with the weight of 8 lives resting on his shoulders. Inside the kitchen, the atmosphere was tense but determined. Marshal Crawford was examining maps of the surrounding terrain, while Sheriff Morgan positioned his deputies at windows and doors that offered good fields of fire. Dr. Harrison had finished treating Miguel's shoulder wound and was now checking his medical supplies in case more serious injuries occurred. 1 hour, Thomas announced as he came back inside. Then Wade starts shooting in earnest. What's our tactical situation? Marshal Crawford asked. Thomas spread a hand-drawn map of his ranch on the kitchen table, marking the locations where Wade's men had been spotted. 8 riflemen in prepared positions, commanding all approaches to the house. We're outnumbered and outgunned, but we have defensive advantages. This house was built with Indian raids in mind, so the walls are thick enough to stop rifle bullets. The barn has a stone foundation that's essentially bulletproof, and the root cellar underneath is completely protected. What about supplies? Sheriff Morgan asked. Enough food for several days, plenty of water from the well, and sufficient ammunition for extended fight if we're careful about our targets, Thomas replied. But Wade's right about one thing. If this turns into a siege, time favors him. He can bring in more men, more supplies, maybe even artillery from the railroad depot. Emma had been listening to their tactical discussion with the intense concentration of someone whose life depended on understanding adult planning. Now she spoke up with an idea that surprised everyone. What if we don't wait for them to attack us? What if we attack them first? The adults looked at the 8-year-old girl with expressions ranging from surprise to concern. Thomas knelt beside her chair to bring himself to her eye level. What do you mean, child? I mean, Mr. Wade needs me alive to find Mama's papers. If I surrender myself to him, he'll have to take me to wherever the papers are hidden, and then you could follow us and rescue me while catching him away from his men. The kitchen fell silent as everyone processed the implications of Emma's suggestion. It was tactically sound in several ways. It would separate Wade from his mercenaries, draw him away from his prepared positions, and give them a chance to capture him alive for questioning. But it also put an 8-year-old girl directly into the hands of a man who had already murdered her mother and tortured her for months. Absolutely not, Thomas said firmly. Emma, I understand what you're thinking, but I won't use a child as bait, no matter how good the tactical reasoning. But it's not using me as bait if it's my idea, Emma argued, with the relentless logic of childhood. And besides, he won't hurt me until he has the papers. That gives you time to save me. Dr. Harrison spoke up from where he was organizing his medical supplies. Even if the plan worked perfectly, the stress and physical demands could seriously damage Emma's healing leg. She's not strong enough yet for that kind of ordeal. Before Emma could argue further, the sound of gunfire erupted from multiple directions around the ranch. Not aimed shots, but systematic volleys designed to test their defenses and force them to reveal their positions. Thomas grabbed his Winchester and moved to the front window, where he could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different positions in the tree line. Bullets struck the house's log walls with solid thuds, sending splinters flying but not penetrating the thick timber construction. Return fire, Marshal Crawford ordered his men. Make them keep their heads down, but don't waste ammunition on targets you can't see clearly. The battle was joined with the methodical precision of professionals on both sides. Wade's mercenaries maintained steady pressure with aimed shots at windows and doors, while the defenders responded with carefully placed fire designed to disrupt any attempts at coordinated movement. Thomas found himself settling into the familiar rhythm of combat, the heightened awareness and mechanical precision that had kept him alive through dozens of similar fights during the war. Load, aim, fire, reload, identify targets, estimate range, adjust for wind and elevation. The skills came back as if 15 years of peace had never happened. A cry from the back of the house announced that one of Sheriff Morgan's deputies had been hit, a bullet through the shoulder that left him wounded but still able to fight. Dr. Harrison immediately moved to treat the injury while the battle continued around him. They're probing our defenses, Marshal Crawford observed, working his own rifle with the steady competence of a man who had fought in too many territorial disputes. Looking for weak spots, trying to identify our firing positions. How long can we hold them? Deputy Wilson asked, reloading his rifle with hands that shook slightly from adrenaline. Depends on their ammunition supply and how patient they're willing to be, Thomas replied, sending a shot toward a muzzle flash that had appeared too long in the same position. He was rewarded with a cry of pain and the sight of blood on snow. But they can't keep this up indefinitely. Sooner or later, they'll have to try a direct assault. As if responding to his words, the gunfire suddenly intensified from all positions simultaneously. Wade's men were laying down covering fire for some kind of movement, probably an attempt to get closer to the house under the protection of concentrated shooting. There, Maria called from the kitchen window, pointing toward the barn. 2 men running for the barn. They have torches. Thomas swiveled his rifle toward the barn and took quick aim at the leading figure. The Winchester spoke, and the man stumbled and fell, his torch flying wide to land harmlessly in the snow. But the second man made it to the barn's wooden siding and immediately began trying to set fire to the structure. Miguel, take the back door, Thomas ordered his wounded foreman. Don't let them burn us out. Miguel grabbed a rifle and headed for the barn, despite his injured shoulder, moving with the determined limp of a man who understood that losing the barn meant losing their defensive position. Thomas heard gunfire from behind the house, followed by Miguel's triumphant shout that the arsonist had been dealt with. But the attack on the barn had been a diversion. While everyone's attention was focused on preventing fire, three of Wade's men had managed to advance to within 50 yards of the house's front wall. They were now in position to lay down devastating fire at close range, potentially making the main rooms uninhabitable. "Everyone to the root cellar," Marshal Crawford ordered. "This position is becoming untenable." But before anyone could move, Emma's voice cut through the noise of gunfire with the clarity of absolute conviction. "Wait, I can end this." She was struggling to stand despite her splinted leg, reaching for something in her dress pocket. When her hand emerged, she was holding a folded piece of paper that looked different from the water rights certificate they had already seen. "Emma, what is that?" Thomas asked, even as bullets continued to strike the house around them. "Insurance," Emma replied with a grimness that belonged on an adult face, not that of an 8-year-old child. "Mama gave me this before she died, told me to keep it secret unless there was no other choice." She unfolded the paper with trembling hands, revealing what appeared to be a railroad company document covered with official stamps and signatures. Thomas took it and read quickly, his eyes widening as he processed the implications of what he was seeing. It was a contract between Vincent Wade and the Union Pacific Railroad, dated 6 months before Wade's marriage to Margaret Carter. The document outlined a systematic plan to acquire water rights throughout Wyoming Territory through fraud, intimidation, and if necessary, murder. Margaret Carter was specifically mentioned as a target for elimination if other methods prove unsuccessful. "This proves premeditation," Marshal Crawford said, studying the document over Thomas's shoulder. "With this evidence, we can hang Wade for conspiracy to commit murder, even without Margaret's body." "But how did your mother get this?" Dr. Harrison asked Emma. "She found it in Mr. Wade's coat pocket 3 weeks before he killed her," Emma replied. "She couldn't read most of it, but she knew it was important because he kept it locked up most of the time. She made me copy it out word for word, then hid the original back where she found it." Thomas felt a surge of admiration for Margaret Carter's courage and foresight. Even while living with a man she suspected might kill her, she had been gathering evidence to protect her children and expose his crimes. "This changes everything," he said. "Wade's not just a murderer, he's part of a criminal conspiracy that reaches all the way to railroad executives in New York. With this document, federal authorities can bring down the entire network." The gunfire outside was intensifying again, and Thomas realized they were running out of time for planning. Wade's men were preparing for a final assault, probably intending to overrun the house before federal reinforcements could arrive. "Emma," he said, making a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life if it went wrong, "are you absolutely certain you want to try your plan? It's dangerous beyond anything a child should have to face." Emma met his eyes with the unflinching directness of someone who had learned to read danger. "Mama died to protect these papers and our water rights. I'm not going to let Mr. Wade win by being afraid." Thomas nodded slowly, recognizing the same kind of courage that had carried soldiers through hopeless battles during the war. "Then here's what we're going to do." The plan was simple but required perfect timing and tremendous courage from everyone involved. Emma would surrender herself to Wade, carrying what appeared to be Margaret's hidden evidence, but was actually a carefully prepared decoy. While Wade was distracted by examining the false papers, Thomas and Marshal Crawford would track them to Wade's command post and launch a surprise attack. The risks were enormous. If Wade discovered the deception too quickly, Emma would be killed immediately. If the tracking went wrong, they would lose their only chance to capture Wade alive. And if the assault failed, everyone in the house would be slaughtered by Wade's remaining mercenaries. But it was their best chance, possibly their only chance, to end the siege before it became a massacre. Thomas spent 20 minutes preparing the decoy documents, using his knowledge of railroad operations to create a convincing forgery that would stand up to quick examination. Dr. Harrison gave Emma a small dose of laudanum to help manage the pain in her healing leg during what would certainly be a difficult journey. Maria blessed both Emma and Thomas in rapid Spanish, tears streaming down her face as she watched the closest thing to a granddaughter she would ever have prepare for mortal danger. Baby Daniel slept peacefully in his basket, unaware that his sister was about to risk everything to secure his future. When the preparations were complete, Thomas carried Emma to the front door and called out to Wade's command post. "Wade, I want to talk." The gunfire gradually died away as Wade's voice responded from somewhere in the distance. Are you ready to surrender those children, Mitchell? I'm ready to make a deal, Thomas called back. Emma has something you want, something her mother hid before you killed her. But she'll only give it to you personally and only if you guarantee safe passage for everyone else. There was a long pause while Wade considered this unexpected development. When he finally responded, his voice carried the sharp edge of desperate hope. What kind of something? The original railroad contracts, Thomas replied. The ones that prove you've been planning this murder for months. Emma knows where her mother hid them, and she's willing to trade that information for her brother's life. Another pause, longer this time. Thomas could imagine Wade wrestling with the implications of Margaret Carter's foresight and his own carelessness in leaving evidence where she could find it. Send out the girl, Wade finally shouted, alone, unarmed, carrying nothing but the information I need. Not a chance, Thomas replied. You come here and get her yourself. Face to face, man to man, so she can see you're not planning to kill her the moment she talks. The negotiation continued for another 10 minutes while Wade tried to find a way to get what he wanted without exposing himself to capture or assassination. But his desperation to recover the incriminating evidence finally overcame his tactical caution. All right, Mitchell, I'm coming in under a white flag, but if this is a trick, if you try to take me prisoner, my men will kill everyone in that house. Thomas watched through the window as Wade approached on horseback, a white cloth tied to his rifle barrel and his hands visible and empty. The man looked haggard and desperate, but still dangerous in the way of a cornered predator. When Wade reached the porch, Thomas stepped outside with Emma in his arms, setting her down gently, but staying close enough to intervene if Wade tried anything violent. Hello, Mr. Wade, Emma said with the formal politeness of a child who had been raised to mind her manners even in extreme circumstances. Hello, Emma, Wade replied, and Thomas was surprised by the genuine gentleness in his voice. I'm sorry things have worked out this way. I never wanted you to be hurt. But you did hurt me, Emma said simply, and you killed my mama. And now you want to steal everything Papa Carter and Mr. Mitchell's grandfather worked for. Wade's face tightened with what might have been genuine regret. Sometimes adults have to make difficult choices, Emma. Sometimes people get hurt when important things are at stake. Important to who? Emma asked with the devastating directness of childhood. Not to me and Daniel, not to Mama, just to you and the railroad people. For a moment, Wade seemed at a loss for words. Then his expression hardened as he remembered why he was there. Where are the papers, Emma? The ones your mother took from my coat? Emma reached into her dress pocket and pulled out the carefully prepared forgeries, holding them just out of Wade's reach. First, you have to promise that Daniel will be safe, and Mr. Mitchell and Maria and Dr. Harrison. Promise they can leave Wyoming without being hurt. Wade's eyes were fixed on the papers with the intensity of a starving man looking at food. I promise, Emma. Give me those documents, and everyone else can go free. Emma handed over the false papers and watched as Wade unfolded them with trembling hands. For several seconds, his face showed relief and satisfaction as he scanned what appeared to be the evidence that could destroy him. Then his expression changed to one of growing suspicion and finally explosive rage as he realized the documents were not what they seemed to be. These are forgeries, Wade snarled, grabbing Emma's arm hard enough to make her cry out. Where are the real papers, you little witch? That was the signal Thomas had been waiting for. His rifle came up in a smooth motion, the muzzle centered on Wade's chest at point-blank range. Let her go, Wade. It's over. But Wade was beyond rational thought now, driven by the desperation of a man who could see the gallows waiting for him, and instead of releasing Emma, he pulled her closer and drew his pistol, pressing the barrel against her head. Drop the rifle, Mitchell, or I'll blow her brains all over this porch. Thomas found himself in the nightmare scenario every parent fears, a split-second choice between tactical advantage and a child's life. The smart move, the military move, would be to take the shot and hope Wade's reflexes weren't fast enough to pull his trigger. But the parental move, the human move, was to surrender and hope for another opportunity. He chose humanity over tactics and let his rifle fall to the porch boards. Good, Wade said, though his voice shook with strain and exhaustion. Now we're going to take a little trip, the three of us. You're going to help me find those real papers, and then we're all going to disappear into the mountains where your federal marshal friends will never find us." "Where are we going?" Thomas asked, calculating distances and opportunities while trying to keep Wade talking. "The church basement," Wade replied. "That's where Margaret hid everything, isn't it, Emma? In the old storage room where she thought nobody would ever look." Emma nodded reluctantly, and Thomas realized that Wade had been more observant during his courtship of Margaret Carter than anyone had given him credit for. The man had probably explored every inch of the community, learning the locations of potential hiding places and escape routes. They made an odd procession as they left the ranch. Wade on horseback with Emma mounted in front of him, Thomas walking alongside with his hands visible and empty, all three of them moving toward a confrontation that would determine whether justice or greed would prevail in Wyoming territory. Behind them, Marshal Crawford was already putting the next phase of the plan into motion. Using the cover of the barn and outbuildings, he and Sheriff Morgan were preparing to follow at a distance, waiting for the right moment to strike when Wade was vulnerable and Emma was out of the line of fire. The journey to the church took nearly an hour through snow-covered terrain that made travel slow and treacherous. Wade pushed them hard, driven by the knowledge that every minute increased the chances of federal intervention. But his horse was showing signs of exhaustion, and Emma was clearly in pain from the jolting ride on her healing leg. When they finally reached the small wooden church that had served the community for 15 years, Wade dismounted and pulled Emma down with him, keeping his pistol pressed against her ribs as they approached the building. "Open it," he ordered Thomas, gesturing toward the heavy oak door with its iron hardware. The church interior was cold and dim, lit only by the pale light filtering through stained glass windows that depicted scenes of salvation and redemption. Their footsteps echoed in the empty space as Wade forced them toward the narrow stairs leading to the basement storage area. Below ground, the storage room was a maze of old furniture, church records, and community supplies stored against future need. Wade pushed Emma toward a collection of wooden boxes stacked against the far wall, his pistol never wavering from its position against her body. "Which box, Emma? Where did your mother hide the evidence?" Emma pointed toward a plain wooden crate marked with a simple cross, her movements slow and reluctant. Wade holstered his pistol long enough to pry open the box, his hands shaking with anticipation as he searched through the contents. What he found was a collection of personal letters, church records, and other papers that had nothing to do with railroad conspiracies or water rights fraud. Margaret Carter had indeed hidden something in the church basement, but it wasn't what Wade expected. "Where are they?" Wade demanded, his voice rising toward hysteria. "Where are the real contracts?" Emma's steady gaze reflected experiences no child should endure. "There never were any real contracts hidden here, Mr. Wade. Mama only made me memorize what was in the papers she found in your coat. She burned the copies after she taught me the words." Wade stared at her in disbelief, realizing that his entire desperate gamble had been based on a misunderstanding. Margaret Carter had been clever enough to memorize the evidence instead of keeping physical proof that could be stolen or destroyed. "Then you can tell me exactly what those papers said," Wade said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Word for word, Emma. And if you leave anything out, if you lie to me about even one detail, I'll kill you and your baby brother both." But Emma's response was not the terrified compliance Wade expected. Instead, she smiled with the confident knowledge of a child who had been holding the winning card all along. "I already told Marshal Crawford everything, Mr. Wade. Every word, every signature, every date. He wrote it all down and sent it to the federal prosecutors in Washington Territory. Even if you kill me now, it won't matter. Everyone already knows what you did." Wade's face went through several shades of rage and disbelief before settling into the pale mask of a man who had just realized his situation was hopeless. But instead of surrendering, instead of accepting the inevitable consequences of his crimes, he chose the final option available to desperate men. If he couldn't escape justice, he could at least eliminate the witness whose testimony would convict him. Wade raised his pistol toward Emma's head, his finger tightening on the trigger with the deliberate motion of a man who had moved beyond caring about anything except revenge. The shot that echoed through the church basement was not from Wade's pistol. Thomas had used Wade's moment of distraction to draw the hideout gun he'd concealed in his boot, a small but effective weapon that he'd carried since his days as a cavalry officer. The bullet took Wade's center mass, spinning him around and sending his own shot wide to shatter against the stone foundation wall. Wade fell backward among the scattered church records, blood spreading across his white shirt as his life drained away into the dusty floor. His last words were a whispered curse directed at the 8-year-old girl whose courage had finally brought him to justice. "Is it over?" Emma asked quietly, her voice steady despite everything she had been through. "It's over," Thomas confirmed, kneeling beside her to check for injuries while keeping his pistol trained on Wade's motionless body. "He can never hurt you or Daniel again." They emerged from the church basement to find Marshal Crawford and Sheriff Morgan waiting with a dozen federal deputies who had arrived from the territorial capital. Wade's hired gunmen had surrendered without a fight once they learned their employer was dead and their payment was no longer guaranteed. The legal aftermath took several weeks to sort out, but the outcome was never in doubt. Emma's testimony, combined with the evidence gathered by federal investigators, exposed a conspiracy involving dozens of railroad executives, territorial officials, and professional criminals. The scandal reached all the way to Washington, resulting in congressional hearings and new federal laws governing territorial development. For Thomas and his newly adopted children, the most important outcome was the quiet ceremony that took place in the federal courthouse 6 weeks later. Judge Harrison Caldwell, a federal appointee with an uncompromising reputation for integrity, performed the adoption with Emma holding her grandfather's water gauge stick and Daniel sleeping peacefully in Maria's arms. "Emma and Daniel Carter," the judge said formally, "by the authority vested in me by the federal government of the United States, I hereby grant your petition for adoption by Thomas Mitchell. From this day forward, you shall be known as Emma Mitchell and Daniel Mitchell, with all the rights, privileges, and protections that family relationship entails." Emma signed the adoption papers with her grandfather's pen, her handwriting careful and deliberate despite her youth. When the ceremony was complete, she looked up at Thomas with tears in her eyes. "Papa Thomas," she said simply, and the word carried all the love and trust a child could give. The railroad company, faced with federal prosecution for conspiracy and murder, chose to negotiate rather than fight. The final agreement guaranteed Emma and Daniel royalty payments that would make them wealthy while ensuring the railroad got the water access they needed for legitimate operations. As spring turned to summer in Wyoming territory, Thomas began rebuilding his ranch with help from neighbors who had rallied around the family that fought so hard to stay together. The new house was larger, with separate bedrooms for the children and a kitchen where Maria could cook for the family she loved as her own grandchildren. Emma's leg healed completely, leaving only a slight limp that didn't prevent her from learning to ride or helping with ranch work. Daniel grew into a healthy, laughing toddler who followed Thomas everywhere, chattering in English and Spanish. The water gauge stick found a place of honor on the mantelpiece, a reminder of the courage it had taken to preserve their family's legacy. Every spring, Thomas taught Emma to measure creek levels and record them on the stick's carved surface, maintaining the tradition her grandfather had started. On quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch was peaceful under the vast Wyoming sky, Thomas sometimes reflected on the chain of events that had brought them together. A winter storm that should have killed 2 children had instead delivered them to safety. A man's greed had destroyed him, while the innocents he tried to harm found family and love. Years passed, and the railroad brought prosperity to the territory. But it was prosperity built on honest negotiation rather than murder and theft, with water flowing from Willow Creek under agreements that respected both law and justice. When Emma came of age, she used her inheritance to attend law school, determined to protect other children from predators like Vincent Wade. Daniel followed Thomas into ranching, developing water management techniques that were studied throughout the West. And every spring they measured Willow Creek with their grandfather's stick, maintaining a tradition that connected them to the courage and determination that made their family possible. Years later, the carved measuring tool would remind visitors that some legacies transcend mere property rights. In the end, the greatest rescues are often mutual. We save others while discovering ourselves. Perhaps that was the real meaning of salvation.